and welcome to the X22 Report. My name is Dave, and this is episode 430, and today's date is August 1st, 2014, and the title of this episode is, Are the Central Bankers Using the Ebola Scare to Declare Martial Law? Now, we're going to get a little bit into this later in the report, and we're going to talk about the Ebola Scare and what the government is doing and what they actually could do if this thing goes widespread, and if it really is true that this is spreading. But let's get into the economic collapse news. Now, yesterday we reported on Argentina, and it was all over the corporate media. They're in a selective default, and that is coming from Standard & Poor's. And today Argentina has accused the U.S. of judicial malpractice for triggering an unnecessary default after U.S. courts allowed two small hedge funds to demand bond compensation from the country. Argentina now has threatened to take the U.S. to international court for justice, and the president of Argentina is saying, no, the country is not in a financial default, stressing that there are still opportunities down in Argentina. And we have to remember, Argentina still is making deals with China and the BRIC nations, and China has loaned billions of dollars to Argentina. We'll have to watch this and see how this plays out. Here in the United States, what are we seeing? Well, the government has come in with their unemployment numbers, and they're not as good as they thought they were going to be. I guess they didn't have the entire statistical team manipulating the numbers, or the numbers were so way off that there were so many people unemployed that it would look really kind of obvious if they said, you know what, the unemployment came down to about 5.8%. But what happened here is that the July payroll print missed. They were expecting about 230,000. It came in around 209. They did a revised number in June, and they revised that up to 298,000. And what we're seeing from all this, and there was a household survey done on who actually has jobs and how many people have found jobs. And what we're seeing when they did this household survey is that only 131,000 jobs were created in July. So it is much, much worse than they're reporting. And this is way down from 407,000 in June. So we can see right now that unemployment ticked up a little bit. But we saw this before, and then all of a sudden unemployment came skyrocketing down. And we can see they are planning for the same thing. Most likely by September we will see an unemployment rate probably around 5.9%. Now it seems it's getting more and more difficult for older workers. They're finding it very tough. As we know, prices are continually increasing, or should I say the value of the dollar is decreasing, making it look like the prices are increasing. But what's really happening is the value of your dollar is decreasing. It takes more of your dollars to buy the same item. And the older population who have been retired need to find extra work because their retirement is most likely fixed, so they have to add on a secondary job to make ends meet. And what we're seeing is that they're pushing out those aged between 25 and 54, and the population 55 and older are taking more and more of these part-time jobs. And they saw with these ages from 25 to 54, about 142,000 jobs declined in the past month because the older population are going to take these jobs and they're keeping them, and some are even taking a secondary job just to make ends meet because things are getting worse as time goes on. Now we see out in the real estate market, and as we know, real estate is imploding on itself, but construction spending plunged most since January of 2011. And we see right now that construction spending has reverted back to December of 2010. And it's a downward trajectory. It is not going up. The trend is down. Now, it looks like the U.S., the EU are very concerned about the BRICS becoming a full-blown financial power. And it is a serious factor in global politics. The BRIC group of emerging economies is becoming a serious factor in global politics, and the European Union and the United States are very concerned on how fast this is growing. And we knew this was going to happen. We understood what was going on around the world. We understand that the dollar is collapsing. It's imploding on itself. This is why we see all these flashpoints and war looming on the horizon right now, I should say. And we can see that the BRIC nations wanted more voting power in the IMF. The United States would not give that to them because they knew if they did, the dollar would be finished. So they decided to create their own BRIC bank to rival the IMF. And we can see right now the BRIC nations, they all work together. They have the same political agenda, and right now they are starting to loan out money to build the emerging economies, their infrastructure. They're building them up, and we can see right now the EU and the US are very nervous about this, and this is why NATO, the United States, have been building up military assets all across the world because they are preparing for war, and we know they are preparing for this because we can see the pivot to Asia. We see the amount of hardware that is out in the Pacific. We see NATO maneuvering all the hardware out in Eastern Europe, bringing in more sophisticated missile shield system. And we can see they've been really propping up their military assets in Central Africa and, of course, the Middle East. So we can see, as I reported time after time, more and more military assets have been being put into place. Now, we see all over the news, and we understand that there's an Ebola breakout, and it's plastered all over the corporate media, and everyone is very, very worried. And I'm looking at this situation, and it seems like this is really being pushed very hard. I know the president just signed an executive order that anyone that has a respiratory or any type of breathing and other things, they have to be looked at. And this is turning into something that it seems like the central bankers, the Obama administration, they're trying to push this very, very hard. Now, I'm not saying this isn't real. I'm not saying there aren't cases, but I think they're using this just like they used the swine flu way back. They were trying to scare everyone and to see how everyone reacted. And right now, it seems like the Center for Disease Control has designated El Paso as one of 20 quarantine stations for the Ebola virus. Now, what's very interesting, they set up these CDC quarantine stations around the country, and they pretty much match where Obama is sending the illegals. There's one sent up in Minnesota, Minneapolis. There's one in Illinois, Chicago. There's one in Michigan, Detroit. We see Massachusetts, Boston. New York is in New York, and New Jersey, it's in Newark. Pennsylvania is Philadelphia. Washington, D.C. We're seeing Georgia, Atlanta. Florida is Miami. Then we have Texas and North Texas. There's one in Houston, one in Dallas, and we see there's one in El Paso. There's one in San Diego, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Seattle, Washington. So this is very similar to where all of the illegals are being sent, which is very interesting of where they set up all these quarantine stations. There are none in the Midwest whatsoever, which is very interesting. Now, the World Health Organization warns Ebola breakout is completely out of control, and it's a high risk of spreading to everywhere. Ebola outbreak that has killed more than 700 people in West Africa is moving faster than the efforts to control the disease, the head of the World Health Organization warned. Dr. Margaret Chan pulled no punches in her direct statement. If the situation continues to deteriorate, the consequences can be catastrophic in terms of loss of lives, but also serves as socio-economic disruption and high risk of spread to other countries. And we're seeing that many sick patients, she's saying, are not going to the isolation centers in these areas, and the fatality rate has been around 60%. Now, this is what they're reporting, and they're saying that is a huge, huge breakout. And we've seen this once before, but let me continue here. The CDC issues alert to avoid unnecessary trips. The problem with air travel is that a person is not infectious unless they are actually showing symptoms, Gregory Hartle. The World Health Organization spokesman in Geneva told everyone about this in his interview. So if you are infected a week ago, but you don't have a fever or any other symptom yet, you can fly and you're not infectious. You're not a danger to anyone, he said. But the point is he's saying that somebody could be carrying it but just not showing the signs, so you're allowed on the plane and you can fly wherever you want. Now, when we look at this entire situation of what's going on, and we can see what's happening, this is what it can turn into, and this is one predictable outcome. Clinics and hospitals frighten people who arrive with what they are labeled early signs of Ebola will be labeled as a probable case. What are those symptoms? Well, it's fever, chill, sore throat, cough, headache, joint pain, and that seems very similar to the flu. So all these people coming in, of course, we're going to be heading out of the summer, moving into the fall and winter where flu season starts. Another point you won't see discussed in the mainstream news, the reliability of the tests used to diagnose Ebola. Two of those tests, antibody and PCR, are notoriously unreliable. Antibody tests will register positive for disease because they ping on factors that have nothing to do with the disease being looked for. And even when those cross-reaction ping doesn't occur, a positive test merely shows that the patient came in contact with the germ in question. It says nothing about whether he's ill or he's going to become ill. The PCR test is a sophisticated way of amplifying tiny bits of what are assumed to be viral material so they can be observed. The problem here is this: if only a tiny bit of material could be found in the patient's body in the first place, there is no reason to suppose they're enough to cause a disease. Very, very large amounts of virus are necessary to begin to suspect the patient is ill or is going to be ill. Bottom line, huge numbers of people on whom these tests are done are going to be falsely diagnosed with Ebola. And in a pandemic scare, diagnostic tests are going to be ignored altogether. They're going to use what's called the eyeball assessment because, and this becomes the order of the day. This is exactly what happened in the U.S. in the summer of 2009 when the swine flu scare was at its height. The Centers for Disease Control, without informing the public, just stopped doing tests and stopped counting number of Americans who had the swine flu cases. Yet, on the basis of zero evidence, they claimed the disease was an expanding nightmare. And where is the swine flu today? It doesn't exist. I mean, there's still many little cases of it, but it wasn't what they said it was going to be. The CDC suddenly claimed that its unverified total of tens of thousands of swine flu cases in America were really tens of millions of cases. As the days and weeks pass, you're going to hear and see all manner of outrageous propaganda about Ebola. People of interest and possible carriers and people who might come in contact with someone who has Ebola will morph into suspected cases of Ebola and victims of Ebola. And it's going to scream global pandemic. They're going to scream global pandemic every 15 seconds to exert control over the population. This is why they're doing it. They want to control the population and obtain compliance from every single person. And they're going to give you orders to stay indoors. Don't travel. Avoid contact with people who might be ill. They will say anything to see how you react. The ever so-called pandemic is a test. How will the population follow orders? The World Health Organization is also in charge of doing damage to national economies. Shut down the airports. No plane should take off for land. Keep the ships in the harbors. This will look like the economy is collapsing because everything will come to a standstill. Now we can see how this could play out in the real world, and let's go further into what is happening here. Now, the federal health authorities could exercise powers to control an Ebola outbreak if the deadly disease hits the United States under the Model State Emergency Health Powers Act. Legislation passed in the wake of 9/11, which attracted controversy at the time for its draconian scope. The Model State Emergency Health Powers Act, drafted during the 2001 anthrax attacks, has since been adopted in whole or in part by 33 states. The Association of American Physicians and Surgeons warned that the legislation could turn governors into dictators, describing the legislation as a threat to fundamental rights. Now, the Heritage Foundation summarized a list of ways the law would be applied in the event of public health emergency being declared. Under this legislation, if they enact this, it will force individuals suspected of harboring an infected disease to undergo medical examinations. Track and share individuals' personal health information, including genetic information. Force persons to be vaccinated, treated, or quarantined for infectious diseases. Mandate that all health care providers report all cases of persons who harbor any illness or health conditions that may be caused by an epidemic or an infectious agent and might pose a substantial risk to a significant number of people or cause a long-term disability. Force pharmacists to report any unusual or any increased prescription rates that may be caused by epidemic diseases. Preempt existing state laws, rules, and regulations, including those related to privacy, medical license, and this is the key, property rights. Control public and private property during public health emergencies, including pharmaceutical manufacturing plants, nursing homes, or other healthcare facilities. Mobilize all or any part of the organized militia into service to the state to help enforce the state orders. Ration firearms, explosives, food, fuel, alcohol, beverages, among other commodities. Impose fines and penalties to enforce these orders. So we can see how they could really blow this out of proportion. And what's very interesting about this is that this would be a disease and it would be an illness, and it really wouldn't come from any other place, and it would be, who would you blame for this? So the government and the central bankers and the Obama administration could use this and say, hey, we have to do this because it's it's a pandemic. It's out of our control. We didn't do this. It's a disease. It's out of control, and we have to try to control it. And this is why we have to implement all of this right now. And I remember back in the swine flu, and it's amazing how fast that came and how fast it disappeared. And I remember all the press when people were out there going, oh, look at the long lines. People are getting vaccinated. Everyone should go get your vaccination. And I didn't do it. I did not get a vaccination at that time. My children didn't get it, and I was completely against it because when I was looking at the situation, something just seemed off. Just this past year, remember when they said about the flu and how it was out of control? Well, was it really? Because all of this just kind of disappeared. Now, here we are now with Ebola, which is very deadly. You can catch it, and it's passed now, they're saying, by air, and before it was just by bodily fluids, and we can see how this can completely get out of control, scare the people, make them take orders, shut down pretty much everything, and they could blame the economy failing due to this. I mean, just think about it. Now, we understand that the illegal aliens, they are continually crossing the border, and that has not stopped. But don't worry, the Obama administration has decided to create a new detention facility in Karnes City, Texas, and this will hold all the adults and the children there. Pretty much they're all teenagers coming across here. And we can see they have this money to set up all these detention facilities, to give them room and board, to clothing. What about all the people that are living on the street who can't find a job, and all those veterans that come back from war that can't get medical assistance, they can't find homes to stay in? It's amazing how the illegals have all of this. They're buying them clothes, but the United States government has no money for our homeless who are citizens here in the United States, for our veterans who fought for this country. They have no money and no ability to take care of them. Why can't we set up these facilities to help them? So what are we seeing now? Well, the illegals are continually coming over, and right now it looks like Homeland Security put out a report saying, yes, the disease is spreading at all the border facilities. Many of the unaccompanied children and family units require treatment for many of the diseases, and you're seeing respiratory illness, tuberculosis, chickenpox, and scabies. And of course now we have Ebola on top of all of this. So we can see all these children now, or I should really call them young adults, are being transferred to all those states that they have a CDC quarantine station located. And they're being sent to about 23 different states right now. And actually, there are more and more states being added, and we can see this on the map that I have on the X22Report.com site. If you go to Resources, and it says Map of Immigrants, and it'll bring you to a map, and if you just click on the pins or the circles, it will explain why the transfer of the illegals to what was a success or was it a failure. And you can read all about that when you go onto the site. Now, it looks like the U.S. buildup in Africa is pretty much rattling China right now. And they have a think tank looking at the situation. And they came up with some information in their annual report. The Chinese Academy of Social Sciences warned in its annual report on the development in Africa that the continent might be used by the United States to expand its containment of China should the Sino-U.S. relationship continue to worsen. But Beijing was not well equipped to handle such a move. It said China had become more proactive in establishing its presence in Africa over the past decade, but would face more resistance from Western nations which had been keeping a close watch on China's activities on the continent. And we know this for a fact that the United States, wherever China is, that's where the U.S. central bankers go. U.S. have been strengthening military ties with Africa in recent years under the pretext of security and anti-terrorism, which we can see they use this all the time as a false flag to get troops into the country. And one of the report's authors, Zhang Hongming, a senior research fellow at the Academy Institute of West Asian and African Studies, the military presence of the U.S. can be used to deter China if the two nations mistrust each other. The U.S. has also announced the establishment of a drone base in Niger last January, which will provide assistance to French forces in Mali and gather intelligence about terrorist activities in North and West Africa. Such military moves can be transformed into an effective tool against China if relations seem to break down. And we can see that from all of this, and even from President Obama, the pivot to Asia was to contain China. The troops inside Central Africa is the same containment. There is absolutely no difference. This has been done on purpose. They are positioning all the military assets around the world. Now, it looks like Russia is looking at the World Trade Organization, and they're looking at the European sanctions, and they're saying, you know what? We might have to cancel these European sanctions. And they went on to say that the EU sanctions need to be analyzed from the legal point of view to establish how they correspond to the World Trade Organization norms and rules. But at first sight, they contradict these norms and rules. In this case, undoubtedly, Russia will seek a WTO action in order to have them canceled. So they want the World Trade Organization to take a look at these sanctions because they're saying they are not conforming to their orders, and it seems like if they are not conforming to their rules, they need to be canceled, and they want the World Trade Organization to look at this. Now, it looks like there's 101 experts on the ground now investigating the cause of the Malaysian Boeing crash. Looks like Kiev is right there also, making sure they don't find any real evidence, and if they do, I'm sure they'll swoop right in and take it from them. Now, out in Ukraine, we are seeing more and more protests from the people. It's a rising wave of anti-war and anti-conscription protest is taking place in cities and towns across western Ukraine. The protests are paralleled by a rise in Ukraine army desertions and refusal of men and women to heed conscription orders. The protests there are gaining ground. And I said this a couple days ago. I wouldn't be surprised if the people rise up there and say enough's enough. You have to remember, their value of their currency is pretty much imploding. Prices are increasing. They have no gas for the winter. Their families are being ordered to fight in a war they don't believe in, and the country is just completely falling apart. The expanding protests have multiple messages. Some oppose the war outright, others are specifically addressing the harsh and dangerous conditions that soldiers are facing in the east. The women went on foot to the bridge carrying place cards reading, "Save our boys," and used a pedestrian crossing to block traffic. They've had skirmishes with the police, and they're screaming and chanting, "We don't want war, we want peace. We do not raise our children for war. We will not give them our children." "Go fight your own war," they tell the conscription officer. They gather dozens of makeshift blue-colored conscription orders into a pile, and they just burn them. They just lit them up and said, "We are not going." And actually, we saw this back in the 60s when they had the draft, and everyone went in and burned their draft cards. And it seems like the same thing's happening here. They're saying, "This is not our war, this is not our country, and you are just forcing us to do things we do not want to do." Now, we see today that Kiev has come out with their satellite images, and it looks like Russia is debunking the satellite images. And when we take a closer look at these images, it does seem a little suspicious, and then we get more confirmation that, yes, these images have been doctored and they are made up. Satellite images Kiev published as proof that it didn't deploy anti-aircraft batteries around MH17 craft site carried altered timestamps and are from days after the tragedy. The tragedy. And they're continually doing this. They're showing pictures of things not at the time, but after it. Remember back when they said the Russian troops were building up on the border of Russia, and they showed a satellite picture from NATO, and it was proven that it was taken from last year when they were doing drills in that area? The same thing seems like it's happening right now. The Defense Ministry said the images were apparently made by an American keyhole reconnaissance satellite. And how do they know this? Well, the Ukrainian satellites, Sich-1 and Sich-2, were not above the location at the time, but the keyhole reconnaissance satellite was. So we can see that all of this is completely fake, phony, and false. And the other thing, when they look at the satellite imagery, is that at the time when this whole Malaysian airline plane was either hit by the Su-27 or a missile, and it looks like it, either story could be right here, the weather patterns do not match up with the satellite imagery that Kiev is trying to push out there. So we can see right now the weather patterns in the cloud formation was completely off. Their satellites weren't above the area at the time, and it was only the U.S. satellites that were above the area at the time. So we can see right now that it most likely was the U.S. gave the satellite images. A couple days later, pretty much, reworked the imagery, faked it just like they've been doing, and handed it off to Kiev and said, "Here, turn this in." And we can see right now, every time this happens, things just aren't true. It seems like they're continually trying to push the lie, and they're not stopping. Now they're trying to prove, that they didn't do it, and of course, we know they did. Now, it looks like the U.S. Senate passed the emergency funding for the Israeli Iron Dome now, and they're going to give about $225 million in additional revenue to Israel because they're running out of missiles, and they need to replenish the missile stock to continually strike down the infrastructure and kill more children and women. Now, it seems like the plan of the United States and Israel and the UK and all the other private Western Central Bank countries, it seems like their plan was to divide Iraq and actually spread this across the Middle East to have a Kurd, Sunni, and Shiite area. And what's very, very interesting, all of a sudden, the United States has proposed a restructuring of the Iraqi military. Officials said the administration of President Barack Obama drafted a plan to form an Iraqi military limited to border operations. The officials said the military would reflect the canonization of Iraq into 3 separate enclaves: Sunni, Shiite, and Kurdish. And troops would be placed in these areas that had to do with those sects that were in that area. So Sunni people would get Sunni troops, Shiite people would get the Shiite troops, and the Kurds would get the Kurd troops. And they would like to start doing this, and this will take a couple months to a year to really establish, and we can see they are paving the road to separate Iraq, and it's going to be all other Middle Eastern countries. This is their plan from the beginning, to separate and put each group into their own area so they don't have this type of fighting and people rising up trying to take over the countries. Will this work? Most likely not. Now we understand from yesterday there's an informant who wants to remain anonymous called Caesar, who's handing out photos to Congress now. But if we do a little bit of research, we go back to January 2014, what we're seeing is that Caesar, which was pretty much backed by Qatar, and you have to remember Qatar just received a lot of military assets, and also we have to understand Qatar was training the Syrian rebels to go into Syria to fight Assad, pretty much was behind all this. And this started before the Geneva II talks. This was put out there where Caesar had all these thousands of photos of people being tortured and how how Assad was torturing his own people. This was put out there before the Geneva II talks to try to push the talks in a certain direction and have the UN come in and say, oh, all right, Assad was torturing his people. Now Caesar is back, but there are a couple things about what is going on here. He's supposed to be an insider, where he had inside access to pretty much everything. But the photos that he is producing are from a hospital of people who've been injured or who have died. Now, if he is an insider, where are the insider pictures? Because this is not proof of anything. This just shows people in the hospital hurt and mangled, and people who were hit by something. It doesn't prove who did it, because we have to remember from many videos we see the opposition ripping out hearts. We see the opposition decapitating people. We see the opposition, oh that's right, using sarin gas on the people of Syria. Hey, don't we see the same thing in Ukraine and the same thing that Israel's doing? Using weapons of mass destruction, just killing people? Well, the same thing here. So that's red flag number one. If he's an insider, we should see pictures of inside these prisons of the soldiers actually doing it. But guess what? That's not what these pictures are. It's not there. These pictures were taken in a military hospital. So the pictures are meaningless. It reminds me of the false flag event when they showed the pictures of the people being gassed in Syria. It wasn't proof. It was the after effect of what happened. The proof is actually seeing which side did it. But the United States government central bankers, they don't have that proof. So they like to show what happened afterwards. And they use this as their proof so they can work backwards to pin it on whoever they wanted. And we saw this happen in August of 2013 when they used a chemical false flag attack, and we found out that this was completely fake, phony, and it did not work. And all these pictures were taken on a digital camera. They were put on a USB. There was like no hard copies or anything like that. And if this person was truly an insider, he would have insider knowledge. He would have insider pictures, and we would see pictures like we've never seen before of actual things going on. Now, the Guardian and other sources said, yes, these pictures are definitely credible. They were not doctored. Well, I'm sure they weren't, and I'm sure they're real pictures, but it's real pictures of just people being hurt who have died in a hospital. Yes, they could be credible pictures, but they're not credible pictures of showing torture. You have to listen to how they say this. Now, all of this was presented back during the Geneva II talks back in January, February, March, when they were having all these talks, and they completely fell apart because on the agenda was to prove that Assad had to be removed. They wanted him removed. They were trying to show that he was torturing his people, and that fell apart. Then the elections happened and other things, and now Caesar is back now showing Congress because they want to ramp this up for some type of an event, and you can see they are definitely pushing this agenda. Listen, everyone, thanks a lot for listening. Be well, be safe, and especially be prepared. Thanks a lot.